both the same major.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for letting me know, Missy.
Important.
Facility.
I know, but
Thank
I don't
you.
wanna go to Portland.
You can't have too much consolidation, something that unfortunately for this country.
Okay, good afternoon. Let's get rolling for today. So welcome back. We are continuing our discussion about listening and engaging effectively in small groups. Just as a reminder for folks, the quiz for week 2 is due by the end of the day today. And then the week 3 quiz, along with the small group reflection, is due this Sunday. I'm still happy to look over rough drafts or outlines if you would like to send those to me in advance. I just need them by the end of the day on Friday. What I've seen so far looks pretty good. Just remember, whenever you're drawing from a concept or an idea from the course, that's a good opportunity to include an in-text citation. So best of luck as you're continuing to work through that. Let me know if you've got any questions there. So on Monday, we started to look at the role of listening in small group communication, some of the challenges and some of the dynamics that come with listening in these contexts. We also talked about what it means to be good listeners in small groups. And we did an activity for Monday's class in which I asked you to listen to other folks in the class discuss the ways that you all might approach and think about social media, and then to report on the perspectives of other people in the group to help you with your recall and thinking about how you do listen. We'll be doing another group activity for today, and as a reminder, one of the later assignments in the class is going to ask you to take the group activities we've done and to think about your own communication and your role in some of these in-class activities. So we discussed some of these challenges, right? Listening in general is a skill that we're not really trained to do, we're just told to do it well. But there's a lot of different steps that we can take to be good listeners. In particular, in group settings, we oftentimes have a bystander effect where we're less likely to volunteer to do a task because we think somebody else will do it. We also talked about some of the challenges of engaging in a group when there are several members, when there's so many different people that we're trying to listen to pay attention to, and to cognitively switch to understand over time. So all of this is useful context that we'll be building on for today. In particular, one thing we'll be emphasizing today is the importance of creating a good listening environment, right? So not only are we good at understanding how to listen effectively with each other, but listening starts with preparation. It's taking on the steps that are needed to listen effectively in a group. We'll talk about some of the ways that we do listening effectively, and we'll be doing an activity in which I ask you in groups to think about how to create an effective listening environment in a case of interviewing people for a job. So, can listening happen digitally? Well, the answer is yes, but there are a lot of specific things that we need to think about, right? Over the last 2 years, we know that so many meetings and so many forms of communication have switched to digital platforms. I just said 2 years, but now it's more like 3 years. I don't know what's happened to time since 2020. It's all slush. So listening can happen digitally, but there's a lot of things that we have to think about when we're thinking about how to listen to other people and create an environment that works well for listening. One of the first things that we have to consider here is the use of synchronous channels, right? So synchronous refers to communication that's happening in real time with other people using virtual environments. So if you've ever taken a class that's remote through Zoom or something like Google Meet, that's probably just about all of you over the last 2 or 3 years, then you've had to listen in these kind of synchronous settings, and it can be really difficult, right? So one thing that we can think back to is earlier in class, I talked about the idea of media richness theory, right? Where media run a spectrum from being very lean or cold media, things such as an email or text message thread, which is very detached, all the way up to what's considered to be very hot or rich media, which refers to things such as a video call or a phone call, right? The difference here is the amount of sensory engagement that you get from that form of communication. One thing you might know if you've taken a class like interpersonal communication is that up to 80% of our communication that happens face-to-face is communication that happens non-verbally. That can be things such as our tone of voice, our facial expression, the clothing choices that we've made, right? Our use of physicality and proximity, the volume and pitch of what we have to say. There are a lot of different categories that make up the elements of nonverbal communication. And studies show that cognitively, we're more likely to trust the nonverbal communication than verbal communication. Again, if somebody says, "I'm happy to see you," sarcastically, we're more likely to take up the tone of voice as being true and indicating sarcasm rather than the verbal language of them saying that they're happy to see us. As a result of that, right, we have to think carefully about how we engage in synchronous listening. It's more challenging when we don't have the use of nonverbal communication, or we have a two-dimensional space to communicate nonverbally with someone, right? So our ability to pick up on those subtleties or cues is more challenging, or maybe, right, we're in our car and we have the driving mode for a Zoom meeting, and we can't really engage in the same way either, right? So we have to work overtime in trying to understand and pick up on other elements. By the way, Nonverbal communication would include things such as tone of voice or volume. Think about verbal as the actual use of language, right? Nonverbal referring to how it's said. So there are some nonverbal cues that we can pick up on in something like a phone call, but we do have to work extra hard to understand them and perhaps might punctuate them a little bit more too, right? That's why things like emojis are so popular, is because they're ways to visually represent and add to and accent the way that we communicate when just sending messages is a lot less emotionally clear. Asynchronous listening is possible. So oftentimes when we think of listening, we think of something that's verbal that we're hearing, but when we think about a message, we're thinking about typically something that you read, right? You read a message, you comprehend the message, you read an email. We don't normally say that you listen to an email, but it is possible, right? What it means to listen to a message asynchronously means that you're really taking the time to comprehend and understand what the message is saying. Think back to active listening, the way that we really try to fully understand and read between the lines too. If we're texting somebody and they're talking and saying that they're doing okay, but perhaps the speed at which they're texting, maybe we saw bubbles for a really long time, followed by a short message. The things that we know about the person might lead us to believe that no, they're not doing okay, and they're in need of extra support, right? Our ability to listen and pay attention to the message in a really clear way would be considered to be listening rather than just reading. So I like to think about good listening in a group setting as kind of being like a dance between two people, right? In this way, listening is not just about you paying attention, you being there, you being attentive, as we talked about on Monday, right? It's also the responsibility of people who are speaking, who are hosting, who are running a group and its meetings to create an environment and a context that allows people to listen effectively. I'll give you an example. Say you are a new member of a team on campus, like the softball team, right? And you go to the first meeting, and all of a sudden, all the other people on the team who have been there longer than you start talking about all sorts of jargon, right? They use acronyms and abbreviations that you've never heard of. They start talking about former students and coaches that you have no background or frame of reference for. They start talking about competitions that you've never been to, right? They're sharing a lot of information, a lot of jargon, a lot of technical language, and a lot of history of the group that you're not privy to. And as a result of that, right, they're not creating an listenable environment for you. You're feeling boxed out and unincluded because you're not able to understand or follow along what all the people are saying, right? My partner works for the Oregon Health Authority for the state. And every day she comes home and talks about how much jargon and like technical language there is in that group, right? Now I can't make heads or tails of it, but it's an example here of how the use of jargon and technical language makes it more difficult for us to understand and listen to each other. How can I listen if I don't know what you're saying or speaking an entirely different language? So a few steps that we could do as part of a group, right? One thing that we could do is to break down and explain some of the language that might be unclear, right? Using things like an info sheet or actually saying out what an abbreviation is, right? NGO, non-governmental organization. Another thing we could do is to open up space for people to ask questions or to provide clarification. And another important element is creating an environment in which people are brought in and comfortable with asking questions in the first place, right? There are no bad questions. The opportunity for people to ask those and feel safe doing so is really important. And then there's social decentering, right? That's the Atticus Finch, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. And this is important when we're thinking about how to create a good listenable environment. You might be a senior member of the softball team. You might be really familiar with it. You might know all the competitions and things that you do on the team, but you might think back to your first day. What was it like when you just started out? And you might think back, oh yeah, I was a first-year student. I was trying to figure my classes out. I was trying to transition from high school to college and understand what this LeGrand place is all about and have greater difficulty engaging on that basis, right? So decentering, imagining yourself in somebody else's perspective and checking in with the person to better understand where they're coming from is an important step that we can take to improve listening, right? If we're doing a dance and the other person has not been taught the moves or, is not following our lead in the dance, right? It's not really working together. And in the same way, we can't expect people to listen if we're not giving them the resources that they need to be able to listen. And a really big part of that is the role of pre-listening, right? So we'll be talking about that a bit more in today's activity, but pre-listening refers to the ways that you physically or digitally prepare for a group meeting, right? This could be a meeting that's happening face-to-face. Perhaps you're starting out a new club, or you're tasked with hosting a meeting for a club. Perhaps you have a work meeting that you're trying to run, or perhaps you created an online club, a group, a guild, like a D&D group, and you're trying to work together to create a good online space, right? There's a lot of things that can go wrong in a group meeting, right? Murphy's Law is whatever can go wrong will go wrong. But pre-listening is a way we can control for those variables, okay? This is directly helpful for us if you have ever worked in a study group, if you've ever worked with roommates, or you ever find yourself working with other people on a group project or a class. Some of these things will, I promise, improve how the meetings go. One of the first things that you can do is to manage the physical location, right? So where is this meeting being held and why? One of the best things you can do before a meeting happens, if you're hosting a meeting, is to check the physical space and make sure that the physical space is working the way that it needs to, right? For example, before class, on our first class meeting, I was noticing that the tech and the projector was not working correctly. So I called IT, and we had IT come and fix it during class, while also getting that makeshift PowerPoint working on the TV, right? And doing that kind of prep work to check for tech issues is an important way that you can make sure that meetings run a little bit better, right? How big is the meeting space? If you had a classroom like this one and you had a group of 6 people, well, naturally, people are probably going to scatter around a little bit. So you might go into the meeting early and reconfigure the desks so that you have them together in a circle or a square so that people are more directly speaking to each other, because that's what you want the meeting to be like. So managing the physical location in that way is important. Also think about the time of the meeting. I can tell you that if you have a 3-hour meeting that runs from 11 to 2, and you're not really offering breaks, or you're not really offering lunch beforehand, about 45 minutes in, people are going to get really antsy because they're going to be hungry. They're going to want lunch, right? So what are you going to do about that? Maybe you reschedule the meeting. Maybe you offer like a half-hour break for lunch. Maybe you bring in box lunch as the group is working, right? So all of those things are really important to ensure that the environment in which you're communicating is as hospitable as it can be, right? Think about time of day. Think about the use of things like breaks as a way of managing the physical location. There's some things you can't control, like white noise, how like loud or crowded the space is it outdoor or indoor? What's the weather looking like? So controlling for those variables is important. Listening tasks, right? So ahead of time, you might ask people to listen in the meeting in very different ways. So to listen in the meeting as like a plant or a participant who's offering ideas and thinking outside of the box, very different than somebody who might be asked to take notes. In that case, you are looking for a really comprehensive listener who's really able to fully grasp the material. Or perhaps before the meeting starts, you want somebody to play devil's advocate and argue for an opposing view. So they're going to be listening in a way that's priming them to respond and disagree with the perspective that they're being given. Another thing that's important to do is to confirm those norms, to say, hey, Dan, I checked up with you before class to see if you were okay being devil's advocate. Does that still work for you? Do you still want to do that, right? Contextual barriers to listening is an important thing for us to consider here, right? As mentioned, perhaps there's information that we simply don't have about the group, such as the use of acronyms, abbreviations, and other jargon that group members just don't know, and we don't want to assume that they do. Another factor might be language, right? So perhaps you have people who speak English as second language and are not able to communicate in the group in quite the same way, who need additional time, support, and understanding to fully understand the message, right? Another thing to think about here is if you're doing something like a digital meeting, to think about the role of accessibility. A lot of virtual meetings have included ASL interpreters or the use of closed captioning or subtitles. My partner used to work as the executive director of a disability rights nonprofit, and they had some group member meetings And there were no members of the group at the time who themselves were blind or in need of additional visual support. So while they wouldn't have required like screen readers or screen reading accessibility, they decided to do so anyway because they knew that the meetings were going to be recorded and posted for later, so that blind folks were able to access and understand what was going on in the meetings, right? Similarly, for deaf and hard of hearing folks, the use of ASL interpreters was provided too. That idea being that there are factors like accessibility that might impact our ability to listen and understand a message, and thinking about how we can support individuals and create a more accessible space is important. Recognizing biases is another factor that impacts our listening, right? People are going to come into meetings with takes and with opinions. Perhaps you've been on the softball team for a while and you hate this one competition that happens every year in Boise. And you say, as we're going into the meeting, I do not want us to go to Boise again. You know, we nearly crashed the last time we tried to drive out there. I don't like this competition. We shouldn't do it, right? Recognizing that coming in, you have a member of the group who has that bias and that's going to impact the flow of the conversation is important, so that you can anticipate that and recognize where they're coming from. Another important thing to consider is that biases can come in when it comes to social, political, or cultural views on given topics. If you're inviting somebody like a speaker who comes in from a particular political or social environment, you know that that's going to color or shape the way that you interpret their message, right? I wanted to show you a good example of a listening environment done poorly, including the role of biases and the role of messages that I think are distracting from the overall message. And if I ever want to look at examples of bad group communication, all I need to do is watch recordings of US Congress. So a lot of you might be familiar with the Ticketmaster stuff that happened a few months ago, right? So Taylor Swift announced a nationwide tour, and Ticketmaster, which was the web host that provided the tickets, had so many tech issues. For example, the stuff completely crashing, people getting charged for tickets that they didn't receive, and so forth, that the whole debacle had launched a recent congressional investigation and congressional hearing. The weird part, though, is that we had US senators, members of Congress, who were trying to incorporate quotations from Taylor Swift into the congressional hearing, which in my opinion is an example of distracting messages, biased messages, and the use of not creating a particularly great listening environment. I thought it'd be fun to share this example here.
You can't have too much consolidation, something that unfortunately for this country, as a ode to Taylor Swift, I will say, we know all too well.
A lot of people seem to think that's somehow a solution. I think it's a nightmare dressed like a daydream.
A few million Taylor Swift fans would respond, this is why we can't have nice things.
But once again, she's cheer captain and I'm on the bleachers.
Ticketmaster ought to look in the mirror.
And say, I'm the problem. It's me.
So I could be a little cringe, but at least I'm not US Senator trying to quote Taylor Swift at a congressional hearing for HP. So again, a good example of how like a good pre-listening environment was not really created because the messaging, right, the use of quotations was distracting from the content of the meeting that they were probably trying to share. Another thing that's good to consider is whether to take notes or recordings ahead of time, right? So one really cool option you can do on Zoom is if you're hosting a meeting, typically you'll have the option ahead of time to either record directly to your computer or record to the cloud, right? So for classes like this one, I check the options so that it records to the cloud in advance to make sure that that's all taken care of so that it can be posted after class. Another thing that you can do, right, is make sure that somebody is taking notes or tracking minutes. Again, taking minutes or notes is great for people who can't attend the meeting. It's great to confirm if there was a disagreement as to what happened during the meeting, and is a great way for people to refresh on the previous meeting before they go into the new one. So however you do it, making sure it's done is a good idea. And then determining when and how often to take breaks, right? Breaks are good things. Breaks help us to stay refreshed and stay focused, and be especially concerned about the use of timing, right? And are you conflicting with something like mealtime or hosting a meeting at a time that might be more difficult for people to attend. All things that are important to create a good environment. I'll give you another example. So 2 or 3 months ago, I was involved in a small group meeting. My colleagues and I were asked to attend a meeting that was like downstairs in a new room that had been renovated down below in Ackerman. And I don't know about you, but I did not know how to go down there, right? So a bunch of my colleagues and I were just like wandering the halls trying to figure out how to access this lower down room because we weren't given directions ahead of time about where this room was located. So it's important for us to check in and provide information in advance that allows us to physically access the meeting in the way that we need to, right? Control from Murphy's Law. So we've talked a bit about some of the ways we can be a good listener in a group, but I particularly want to emphasize the ways that we can create a good listening environment if you're a leader or somebody that's running a group, right? So one of the things that's important is to determine and keep a purpose in mind for the group meeting. We can easily do this by creating something like an agenda or an outline in advance, or reminding people about the meeting, right? Or providing a little bit of a blurb at the beginning of the meeting that clarifies what the meeting is about, right? One thing you hear time and time again in work settings is people saying, this is a meeting that could have been an email, right? And the ability to clarify why you're meeting, what you're discussing, and what you hope to get out of the meeting is a really good framing tool that helps people stay on the same page. Identifying the level that people communicate a message is important too, right? So at what level are you asking people to engage? If you're in a Zoom meeting, are you asking people to have video and audio on, or is it okay for them to use the chat, right? So try to determine what you're expecting from people in the meeting. Figuring out the significance of comments and main ideas is important too, right? Meetings get really off track because typically they'll start with a detail or a point that is relevant and does have something to offer, but gets so far off base that it doesn't really circle back or add to the original point. Maybe you're talking about the softball team schedule, you're talking about how much you hate going to this competition in Boise, and you start telling the story about how your whole band slid off the ice while you were there. People in the group might be like, what's this about? So circling it back, and as you're listening, paying attention to why the story is being told in conjunction with the main idea is important. Urging less dominant people to speak, right? So if you're leading a group and you notice, oh, hey, Diane, I know that you haven't had the chance to share. I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's a really good strategy to make sure people are included, right? If people are left out or don't feel like they have the opportunity to speak, they're going to disengage more and more over time. Another thing that you can do is if you're a participant in the group, you notice that somebody's trying to share something and they keep getting cut off, or they're not called on, you could always raise your own hand or offer your own thought and say, hey, Diane has had something to say or has had her hand up for a while. I'd like to hear her thoughts. Listening non-verbally, as we've talked about, doing things like nodding, saying showing that you're understanding a message is important. Sometimes, like you're in a Zoom meeting and you're even using like reactions, like a thumbs up react to show that you're participating. Tentative and confirming statements are a really good way to show momentum during a meeting. So maybe you're working on developing the softball schedule and you take a pause and say, okay, so it sounds like nobody here wants to attend this competition in Boise. Are we all on the same page, right? Trying to summarize a point and figure out if the group has reached a conclusion about something is a really good way to show progress, to convey understanding, and to figure out if there is any source of disagreement that the group needs to still work through. Interrupting when appropriate. So again, interrupting is generally something that we should avoid, but there are situations in which it makes sense to interrupt if somebody is getting off topic or somebody is not giving information that's pertinent, right? Somebody's muted in a group meeting, right? We should flag that for them. Paraphrasing, again, is useful as long as it doesn't go too far to restate somebody's point. Thinking carefully about how to respond. Think back to last class, Jefferson rule, count to 10 in your head if there's a message that you really disagree with and want to push back against so that your response can be a little bit more thoughtful. And leaving opportunity for silence. In public speaking, I like to talk about how oftentimes we use things like verbal fillers, saying and and we do that because we like to fill in the space. We think it's awkward and uncomfortable if we aren't all always filling in work. But if you're in a group and the group members need time to reflect and think on something, they haven't had the same time that you have to think over an issue. Maybe there's news that you have and information that they need time to take in. Giving people that time to think through it and process it, or giving people time to work together on a task or develop an opinion on something that they haven't had the resources to develop an opinion on prior. Taking that time is really important. So bad listening. So I go to a lot of conferences, right? And the way academic conferences are set up, typically you have a panel of people who are presenting their research, and then you have like 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. A lot of other conferences that have panels, like even things like Comic-Con, are the same way, right? And there's a trope in which at a lot of conferences or a lot of panels or discussions, you have people who provide what is more of a statement than a question, where people are expressing their own opinion, their own take. They say, well, if I was doing this research, I would have done it this way, and go on and on and on and make it about that. But try to frame it as a question, right? So that's a bad practice. It's a counterfeit question. It's like not asking a question that's constructive to the group, and instead, trying to dominate and recenter the spotlight on yourself. So there's challenges that come in how we effectively listen and work together in groups. One big pitfall is letting listening become a dead end. So a few months ago, I watched the comedy movie Bros, right? And part of the movie is that there's a group, it's a small group who is working together to create like a gay pride exhibit for like LGBTQ representation, right? And there's a member of the group as they're trying to figure out like this display and how to do the presentation. And they keep interrupting by saying, I'm holding space for you, or I'm listening, or I validate, or I hear you, right? We hear that language used a lot. And there are a lot of contexts where that type of language is appropriate and helpful, right? But the joke comes in because that person continues to say that over and over again. I hear you when somebody is frustrated, but it's not going anywhere, right? They're not doing anything with that information or offering people any solutions to an issue, right? Imagine if you're at work and you're going on and on about how your coworker is not coming up to shifts, is not working, is not doing their job, right? And you bring that up to your boss, and your boss says, oh yeah, I hear you. I'm listening to you. I validate you, right? That's not the response you want. You want your boss to be like, okay, I'm on it. I'm going to talk to them. So letting listening become a dead end, where you're listening, you're hearing comments, you're hearing feedback, but you're not doing anything about it or allowing that to drive the conversation or drive solutions, that's a big problem, right? So listening should not be an end to itself. We should give people the chance to listen. We should recognize when there are some things we can't do, but listening should not be an end to itself. It should be guiding the discussion. Allowing listening of other people to impact you, right? So oftentimes we look at how other people are or are not listening and use that to determine whether or not we should be listening. So if you're in a group and you know that this is an important meeting and you know that you should be paying attention really closely, and you notice that other people in the group are on their phones or disengaged, right? You're more likely to take on that behavior yourself. But standing out in a positive way can be useful in group settings too, right? It can help you to stand out in how you're listening and understanding the message. Don't cut off or put somebody down in a hurtful or disrespectful way. It's pretty straightforward. Interrupting excessively, right? Especially to make it about yourself is a problem. Counterfeit questions, again, not really a question, and framing something in a disrespectful way. So somebody comes in late to a meeting and you're like, oh, hey, did you get a good sleep? Right? That'd be an example of using that. Letting tone color interpretation is another thing to consider, right? So fundamental attribution error is a concept in psychology and sociology, right? That refers to the idea that somebody might be in a bad mood. It might come across as abrupt or direct, and we might misattribute their mood in the moment to describe their entire personality or how they behave, right? You might be familiar with certain abbreviations, right? Like RBF, somebody who starts out by having a neutral expression that might look angry, and we misinterpret that to mean that they're mad at us, right? That doesn't necessarily convey their real thoughts. Or somebody is excited, but they seem really monotone. So don't read too much into the tone or the way that somebody is speaking when there are other environmental factors that could be contributing to how they intend to come across. and expressing your interpretation of a message accessibly. So paraphrasing is important, right? Showing that you understand a message is important, but if you get too far into saying your interpretation of what somebody said, it again turns it back into you. So saying, let me see if I understand your point, paraphrase your point, and give them the chance to respond. Don't make it that you're drowning out their perspective by offering your perspective. So all things we should avoid when it comes to how we listen in a group setting. So here's what I want us to do now. And to continue to break things up, I'm going to do two larger groups this meeting, give more people the chance to talk and get to know each other. So you and your group members are all working for a local newspaper company. Think something like the Rio Grande Observer. So your group is currently interviewing candidates for a new writer that you're going to hire. What I'd like you to discuss, and you can have one person in your group who will write or type, is to explain in as much detail as you can how your group is going to use pre-listening to create a listenable environment for your job candidates. What are the things you're going to do to ensure that the space and preparation of that environment is good for listening? You might explain how specific roles might be taken on in preparation too. And you should assume this is a face-to-face meeting. And then secondarily, I want you to assume that candidates are now being interviewed via Zoom. How might you create a good listenable environment using that platform? So I'll give you about 10 to 15 minutes to discuss and share your thoughts in groups, and then give you the opportunity to work to bring them back to the class. So we've got so make things a little bit more interesting. So we will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So if you're in the first group, you might be here on this side, second group on this side. Take some time to make sure you've got your names, share, write down your thoughts, and we'll talk about these things together.
Yeah, all right, so number one. We have to, what would we do to create the we can have on this name. All right. So we got Charles recorded. So we got that. We need to start. I'm gonna make sure that we learn. So are you listening? We got, we just put that on the list that we're running out there.
So are we doing them like they're meeting the all of us, or are we doing a setting up the interest?
Sounds like we're just setting up now.
Like we should go for
Yeah. I'll make sure that, so. Yeah, let's go to that, and that's the contact. So first off, this we have managed location. So I wrote down for that, I like to make sure that the interviewer is face to face with the person, usually make eye contact. It'll get non-verbal cues. Yeah, if not breathing out.
space that's not too big for such a short, like a minimal space, but not short. Like, no, that's feel like no music. Where someone both parties like campus on the child.
Anything else? We have 500.
It's more-
Yeah, kind of a one-on-one, you know. through,
Maybe the way.
uh, that you know, no distractions, they get. And stuff like that. All right, okay, I feel like that was pretty good. Side listening tasks, I have that one, probably have two people in the meeting. Ask questions, and another one's concentrating on taking notes. People.
Or even multiple people like to see them, to see it. Outside perspective.
Yeah, the assumers are waiting. We'll go on to the second one.
Or there's just like talent stuff.
Now I want to. So. Make sure you get a laptop.
But if the firm listening on just it's probably gonna be like one person is like asking questions and then people can like chime in and stuff and designated that somebody is like leading more than others. So it doesn't get like overwhelmed.
Right, basically, you should have someone, you know, talking to the candidate directly, you know, asking questions and whatnot, like you said earlier. And then you should have someone who's kind of making notes of responses and stuff. You know, if you are gonna do like a 2-person interview, like, and have someone taking notes, then you're gonna want them to kind of. I think one more. Anything else? Yeah, I think it introduces like a gesture, like, you know, what your response to action helps a lot, like giving. A little bit of open board, a lot of. All right, I'll just pass this around and you'll make anyone else on there. Contextual barriers to listening. I think they might have covered that, with, you know, not being distracting area, right? Make sure there's not any business, basically. Yeah. Right. Cool. Secretary or something. I've had 2 different. Yeah. But I don't know twice. I've recognized biases. People would really know has bias, so I have to sort that out.
And it's definitely your goal. You never know. Obviously, it is really like a first impression. Study aside your biases.
Yeah, I just.
Get to know the person outside from them.
Yeah.
Be able to look at them.
Yeah, the people have like patterns and stuff. Oh, you just got a good job. It's like what the past. So like. It's just like your biases look at things logically, unless it's sort of a blanket thing. Not a whole lot. In fact, it's what it sounds like is, where the thing goes, we kind of covered that already, right? We have one person dedicated. This is right. Oh, is it a writing one? Interview. Oh, right. Okay, so visual does come into play a little more. Okay. And how long do you take breaks? I imagine like your interview's probably not that long. Yeah, you probably don't need breaks. Yeah. Maybe between interviews.
Yeah.
We discuss, right? I think that's normally the policy, and also not to schedule interviews right back to back, because then that can And we'll just roll it over again. All right, was that all the,
A lot of distracting background.
It's probably something that's on your Zoom. Yeah, you know, make sure, basically, I think first off, make sure all the text works properly. So with my camera, your background's proper, you know, just basically be professional about it. I feel. But especially if we're the company, presumed as a, you know, professional business rather than like, you know, a dog who gets run around in the back. and, you know, What's right? Maybe to let the interviewee know that like, hey, like check. We have another beforehand, man. I'd say that show the expectation of like, you know, look at your work. Get billing. Because that shows. Yeah, like. You have prepared.
You need to make sure you're still.
One of them is
Even
right now, which
though you're behind the camera.
Oh, yeah.
Make sure you're dressed nice.
Right, right.
That's cool.
Don't want to do the classic, well, you know, I don't want to really look for the waste stuff and then stand
We'll
up.
give another minute for groups to finish up and have somebody ready to turn.
We need to consider it as like like such a they don't have, like, maybe they don't have like, something or something. So that they're are able to reach out before interview, stuff like that. Make sure we have that. Yeah. Maybe have all these responsibility and maybe we share. Because you most of the information we don't have. Like having everything prepared.
Basically, yes, have to be prepared. And also allow them to request accommodation if needed, I guess.
Or maybe ask them if we can be part of the interview, if it's okay to record.
Like that a lot, yeah.
Because I think with the interview, just. You have less structure typing. Right?
And you go back and feel like that's one of the few positive, it seems to be recorded like these are close, like.
So let's go ahead and talk about this together. So let's have each group share their responses, some of the things that they chose and why they might have selected them. So let's start here with the group on this side. What did you all do to create a good environment, either face-to-face or online?
So we said for face-to-face was to ensure it's a nice, like quiet place, that's clean office space. Technical issues are ironed out, they can like pull up something on a computer. The time and location is set and like communicated, so people know where to go and when.
Yeah.
Maybe like the attire, like if you're dressing professional or not. Like a set plan of questions, like what you're gonna be talking about with the other person. And then for via Zoom, we said like good Wi-Fi, make sure both parties have like good technology that can be used, whether that's like doing like a mic check to make sure that it can be heard well. Make sure like expectations are known, like you have to have your camera on and the mic on or something. The backgrounds are clear and limited background noise.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've noticed this in the past when I've helped to host meetings for job interviews, right? Oftentimes checking in that the tech and the things that you're requesting for that meeting are things that participants have access to. For example, do they need a device? Do they need extra help? Are they going to be joining through a computer, or do they need like the dial-in code to join through Zoom from a phone, right? Checking in about that information in advance to ensure accessibility is really important. And as you all brought up, like maintaining, a clean and good space and managing that is really important. How about here on this side?
I mean, I feel like most of this is gonna be repetitive, but, the things we said, a little bit of a bigger space, not like too small, too big, it's like feels comfortable. No music, no like radio or TV, be like distracted, set time and location, set aside a spot that's like outside of, like you're gonna be in an office, but like set aside like door or employees and any distractions that could happen. We brought up maybe having one or multiple note takers to have of other perspectives and have them to write down what answer would be. Yeah, for Zoom, no distractions on the backgrounds. Make sure the mic and video is on time. Just act professional, even though it's through Zoom. Be presentable.
Go ahead.
We also said that we wanted for the Zoom to make sure all the tech was working beforehand, you know, that way we wouldn't have any technical difficulties. And also give them a thing like, hey, make sure all of your stuff is working too. You know, give them a heads up on it in case they're not used to it, but you know, if they're not able to manage that, then probably don't really want to hire them. Anyway.
Sure. So, you know, there's, like you all mentioned, a lot of things that you can do in advance to check going in the meeting in advance. Yeah. Oh,
I did have one more. We also brought up asking for permission to record interviews, so maybe look back on that.
yeah, absolutely. And that can sometimes become like a federal and state guideline issue too, that you have to check in and receive consent for that. So, you know, some really good points here about preparing and checking tech, right? You can go into meetings ahead of time. Another practice is to make sure that the hosts set up a meeting, right, and invite people in. So you get a little notification that somebody's coming in. Make sure that they do that. Another thing to be careful about if you're doing like Zoom or Google Meets or something else is making sure the right settings are enabled. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in where the person who's running the meeting is trying to screen share, but they don't have the screen share permission set. And then it turns out that they weren't the ones who created the Zoom meeting that they're running. So they have to like call or text or try to message the person who actually hosts the meeting to get screen sharing enabled so that they can do that. You know, again, Murphy's Law, that can happen in a lot of those online environments. And one thing to think about as well for face-to-face environments is to think about time management, right? As I say in public speaking, the clock is your enemy. If you're running something like interviews, you want to make sure that there's enough time for people to cycle in. Maybe you're giving like a good 5 to 10 minute buffer between people giving interviews, in case you have people who show up late, in case you have interviews that go a little bit long, or in case you want the chance to discuss a candidate or take notes about the candidate as a group before you move on to the next one. So be thinking about the use of time as well and how the amount of time is corresponding to the items that you might need to discuss as a group too. But good observations here about the importance of preparing and ensuring that a space is one that works well for people in the group. So we talked about how we can create good spaces for people through the process of pre-listening, the product of environment, in addition to the direct engagement we have with other people. So for Friday, we're going to look more in depth into listening and communicating effectively in small groups. So please make sure that the names of all your group members are on, and please pass forward your group's prompt for the day. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I will see you again on Friday. Thank you.